Hello, class. We're continuing Unit 6, Part 3. This is Assignment 2, and today we're going to be solving quadratic equations by factoring. So you guys have already learned how to factor, but now we want to take those skills and use them to actually be able to solve the quadratic equations. And just like we did when we were talking about the square root property to solve, we're still trying to find the zeros of our quadratic function. So the zeros of our parabola or our x-intercepts. And those x values are, if you substitute them back in, are the values that would cause the equation to equal 0. So the first concept that I'm introducing to you is called the zero product property. So when we break this down, 0 obviously is the number 0. Product, remember, means to multiply. So we're trying to think of, since we're talking about factors and it's all multiplication, well, we want our whole equation to equal 0. So if we can figure out which numbers cause our factors to equal 0, then the entire equation is going to equal 0. Because when you have 0 times anything, it's always going to equal 0. So it could be 0, could be 0 times 10 is going to give you 0. 0 times 5 is going to give you 0. So 0 times any number we could put in for x is going to give us 0. And we're going to use this concept right here to help us solve when factoring. So let me set up a couple of them for you. Let's say I have x plus 1 and x minus 2 is equal to 0. So this has already been factored. We just want to use the zero product property to determine what our zeros would be. So what we have to do is look at each factor and determine, okay, well, what is going to make this equal 0? Or what is going to make the second factor equal 0? Because if one of them equals 0, then we're either going to have 0 times x minus 2, which is 0, or we're going to have x plus 1 times 0, which is 0. Either way, we're going to end up with 0 for our whole answer. And since it's a quadratic, we should end up with two different answers, or two answers that might be the same number, but at least two, all right? So let's take a look at our two factors here. First is x plus 1. So we can think mentally, okay, what number could I substitute in for x that when I add 1 is going to equal 0? Well, we know that negative 1 plus 1 is going to equal 0. So then x here has to equal negative 1. That's going to be one of your zeros. The other way, if you're not quite sure how we got that, is to take this factor by itself, x plus 1, and make a mini equation with that. We want to know, okay, this factor x plus 1, well, I want it to equal 0, so I'm setting it up to equal 0, and we want to know what x is going to be when that happens. Well, if you solve, you take away 1 from both sides, it would tell you that x is equal to negative 1. Same thing as we got up here in the blue, doing it mentally. In the second factor, x minus 2, well, I know that 2 minus 2 is going to equal 0. So then that tells me that x must equal 2. Again, we could take this factor and set it equal to 0 if we were unsure, and solve, and you find out that x is equal to 2. So for the most part, you have to first factor, and then you're taking those factors, setting them equal to 0, and solving for your two x values, and those are your two zeros. So let's just jot down those steps. So 1, we need to factor. 2, set the factors equal to 0. And 3, solve for x, and those are your zeros. As you get better at this, you can pretty much just do it mentally. So you can look at a factor like x plus 1 and say, okay, well, the opposite of adding 1 would be subtracting 1. That's your inverse property. So -1 plus 1 is 0, then x is -1. All right, well, what minus 2 is going to give me 0? Well, it has to be 2 minus 2, and so the other x I need is 2. All right, so let's look at a couple where we actually have to factor ourselves. This one is 2 terms, and so the first thing that I'm going to try is to take out the greatest common factor because I don't see any perfect squares here. So from 6x squared and 18x, the greatest common factor is 6x. And then remember, you're dividing that greatest common factor out of each term. So 6x squared divided by 6x is going to leave us with x. And a negative 18x divided by 6x is going to leave us with minus 3. So just as we did before, we're going to take each factor, 6x, and set it equal to 0. And then solve each one for x. Well, on this side, I'm just dividing. 0 divided by 6 is 0, which should make sense because up here, 6 times 0 would be the only thing that could give me 0. On the right-hand side, we're adding 3, so x is equal to 3. So your two zeros are 0 and 3. Anytime you have a number, a factor that is just a constant or a coefficient times a variable and there's no plus or minus here, so if you have something that's just an x outside or even an x squared or x cubed if you're dealing with a bigger polynomial, your 0 is always going to be 0 from that. So if you have something like 6x or even just x or 3x or negative 2x, your 0 is going to be 0. And then from the second factor, you can just take the opposite sign, positive 3, and that's what's giving you your second 0. So one other thing before you start to factor, make sure that all of your numbers or terms are on one side of your equal sign, and you want to do that so that the x squared is positive, the lead coefficient is positive. So for this one, I have to bring the negative 22 back over, and we end up with x squared minus 9x minus 22 is equal to 0. So then I need to think, all right, what multiplies to negative 22 and adds to negative 9? Well, I recognize 11 and 2, and if I want negative 9, I want the 11 to be negative. So here comes my factoring, x minus 11, x plus 2, still equal to 0. And that's a really key part, always needs to be equal to 0 before you start this. And then looking at my factors, well, I'll take my first factor, x minus 11, and set it equal to 0. My second factor, x plus 2, and set it equal to 0. And then we're adding 11, so x equals 11. That's one of my zeros. Taking away 2, so x equals negative 2, is my second 0. And remember, from a parabola perspective, that means that your parabola is crossing at negative 2 and positive 11. So it helps give you some extra points when you can find those zeros of your polynomial. All right, and one more just to refresh our memory on the factoring. So when we first begin, it has to be equal to 0. Since 2x squared is positive, I'm just going to move the 5 back over. So we end up with 2x squared minus 3x. If I shifted it across to an equal sign, then it's going to change sign. So minus 5 is equal to 0. This polynomial, this quadratic, has a lead coefficient. So I'm going to do the slide and divide. So we end up with x squared minus 3x minus 10 is equal to 0. Two numbers that multiply to negative 10 and add to negative 3 are 5 and 2. 5 should be negative. So here I get x minus 5, x plus 2 is still equal to 0. And then don't forget we did the sliding up here, so now we have to divide both of those numbers by the lead coefficient. And so x minus 5 over 2 doesn't go in evenly, so I'm just going to move that number in front of the variable. So our factor is 2x minus 5. over on the next factor, 2 over 2 reduces to 1. So this can just become x plus 1 is equal to 0. And then to find your zeros, well, 2x minus 5 is equal to 0. So I can add 5. 2x is equal to 5. Or x is equal to 5 over 2. And that should make sense because up here, if you do positive 5 over 2 minus 5 over 2, that's going to give you 0. For the other, x plus 1, you're just taking away 1. So x is equal to negative 1, and x is equal to 5 over 2. Those are your two zeros. So go ahead and try assignment 12 now, and see if you can factor, and then find your zeros using the zero product property.